Aloha and welcome to our talk, Yin and Yang. Today we'll be talking about both attacking and defending macOS. I'm Patrick Wardle, a principal security researcher here at Jamf, and today I'm stoked to be presenting with coworker Jaron Bradley, who leads detections in our Jamf Protect product. All right, today we're going to start by talking about recent Mac malware specimens that are targeting Apple's desktop platform. And then we're going to talk about offensive attacker techniques. We'll then kind of switch gears and talk about Apple's built-in security mechanisms and why sometimes they may be somewhat insufficient. And then we'll end by talking about the work we're doing here at Jamf that seeks to ensure that Mac users remain ultimately secure. So first up, as I mentioned, let's discuss some recent Mac malware specimens that target macOS, because in order to defend against such threats, it's essential to deeply understand them. So first up, we have Fruit Fly. Fruit Fly was around for about 13 years, remaining completely undetected. It was a persistent backdoor. Its main goal was to spy on victims, unfortunately largely children, through their MacBook's webcam. Some good news is the FBI recently caught the alleged creator, who is awaiting a trial for his rather heinous crimes. But still, the fact that something remains undetected for over a decade, yikes, that kind of is, well, less than ideal. Next up, we have Mommy. Mommy was the first Mac malware of 2018. Its goal was simply to locally man-in-the-middle traffic for surreptitious purposes. And the way it accomplished that was in two steps. Once it was able to infect the system, it first installed a root certificate, and then it modified the infected system's DNS settings to point to an attacker-controlled DNS server. Now, one interesting piece of information about this Mac malware is it actually looks like it's a complete rewrite of a Windows piece of malware named DNS Unlocker. So this actually clearly illustrates that as Macs become ever more prevalent, hackers are porting their Windows malware to Apple's desktop platform. Next, we have a piece of malware that's associated or attributed to the Lazarus group, which is normally recognized as the North Koreans. So due to a lot of the financial sanctions placed against the North Koreans, they've really taken it upon themselves to hack a lot of cryptocurrency exchange as a way to kind of indirectly finance their operations. So in this attack, what they did was they first set up a fake company with a fake website and all. And then they developed a legitimate cryptocurrency trading application, but then surreptitiously added a malicious updater component. What they then did was they emailed users that worked at various cryptocurrency exchanges and basically asked them to review or try out their great new application. Of course, users who kindly decided to test out this application after checking out the website and say, yeah, everything looks good, would ultimately infect themselves, giving the North Koreans access then to these cryptocurrency exchanges and perhaps the cryptocurrency funds. Another piece of Mac malware is Windtail. Windtail was rather unique because it was used in highly targeted attacks against individuals of a certain Middle Eastern government. From a technical point of view, to me, the most noteworthy piece of the malware was its infection vector, which allowed attackers to infect macOS systems via legitimate functionality of macOS, specifically via custom URL handlers. In short, these custom URL handlers allows applications to be downloaded and launched from a web page. So for example, a malicious web page. Windtail is a cyber espionage implant. So its main goal is to find and exfiltrate files and documents of interest. This makes sense. You think hackers who are going after individuals in a government, they're probably most interested in collecting documents and sensitive information. So here's a demo of the Windtail exploit. We'll see a malicious web page both download and then execute the malicious application. Basically, what's happening in the background is once the application has been downloaded, Safari automatically unzips this. Then macOS notices that the application contains a custom URL handler and thus registers it automatically. The malicious code in the web page can then make a request to launch a custom URL, which will get macOS to launch the application. Now, we saw there's one or two pop-ups that's kind of macOS warning users, hey, you know, this web page is about to launch an application. But we all know some amount of users are just going to blindly click through. End result, if the users click OK on those pop-ups, as we can see on the system, the malware has now fully persisted, and the system is completely owned. Next up, we have OS X Creative Update. This is one of the many cryptocurrency miners we see targeting macOS. Probably the most interesting piece of this malware, again, is its infection vector, which is rather creative. So what the hackers did is they were able to coerce the popular Mac app website, macupdate.com, to host various links that pointed to maliciously Trojaned applications for very popular applications. For example, Firefox. This meant that if users went to macupdate.com, for example, to get the latest version of Firefox, instead of getting a pristine copy from Mozilla, they clicked and followed the links on this website. Instead, they would get a maliciously Trojaned version, which would contain the cryptocurrency miner. Rather interestingly, I gave a talk at RSA a few years ago about another piece of malware that seemed completely unrelated, but it actually had the exact same infection vector. So again, hackers somehow have the ability to continually influence the links, for example, on this popular website. And this is unfortunate because, again, the users in this case are really not doing anything wrong, right? We like to pick on users, but in this case, they're going to a legitimate website and downloading what appears to be legitimate applications. But again, the unfortunate reality, if they've been Trojanized, the users end up infecting themselves. All right, now on to 2019. We've recently seen attackers leveraging zero-day vulnerabilities to infect fully patched macOS systems, especially in browsers. For example, Firefox 0 days. So in this example, attackers were installing a macOS backdoor known as NetWire, and again, targeting users of cryptocurrency exchanges, right? All about the money in this case. So what this malware does is it persists as a launch agent, and it has the ability to download and upload files, survey an infected system, and then also remotely execute both processes and shell commands. So obviously gives the attackers complete control, complete remote control over these infected systems. Also via a browser ODE, attackers were deploying a new variant of OS X MOX. In this case, it was variant B. So a new variant, but related to a piece of malware we were already familiar with. So this Mac OS backdoor, the new variant, even though it was related to the old one, was originally detected by 0 antivirus engines on VirusTotal's website. And what this malware would do, once it infected a system, would collect files, generate screenshots or screen captures of the user's desktops, capture keystrokes by installing a keylogger, and also had the ability to spy on users via the mic and the webcam. So clearly, this is a very fully featured macOS backdoor. Finally, we've got a new variant of Apple Juice that popped up just a few weeks ago. Again, via a fake company, hackers would coerce or trick users into installing what the users believed was a legitimate, pristine application. In reality, though, this application contained a malicious component that in the background would install a persistent implant that afforded attackers complete remote command and control over the infected Mac systems. All right, now Jaren's going to talk about attacker techniques.
Thanks. So Patrick's kind of covered some of the different malware techniques and samples that have come out in the past year or so or recent. But Jamf Protect wants to keep you safe from more than just malware. We want to keep you safe from targeted attacks as well. So malware campaigns are generally a global the attacker generally packages malware to get out on as many systems as possible globally. They don't really care whose system it gets on. They just want to get on as many systems as possible. Targeted attacks, on the other hand, are commonly done by what we call advanced persistent threats, or APTs. And these groups want to, they're rather than trying to get on as many systems as possible, they're targeting your company specifically. For whatever secret sauce you might hold or trade secrets, they want possession of those. So they commonly do this by getting on your network, spreading out as much as they can on your network, laying low for a long time, and then just stealing your documents and your secrets as they come across it. So before we understand kind of Jamf does to kind of protect from this. We need to understand what some of these techniques technically are. So there is some overlap between what global malware might go after and how targeted attacks work. One of the early stages in a targeted attack is the delivery. So delivery can happen one of many different ways, but more often than not, social engineering of some type is involved in this delivery stage, whether that be through an email, maybe with a link that says, hey, go to this website that looks legitimate, enter your password. That's a great way to harvest credentials for attackers, and they still commonly do this. Or maybe an email that's very convincing to open a specific document, as we'll get into in a little bit, that might contain a weaponized macro of some type for Office. Now, this is still common today, even though macros have been around forever. There's a reason attackers continue to still use this approach, and that's because it's very easy to put together and because it still works. People still click on these without having any knowledge that a backdoor is being run in the background. Patrick talked a little bit about browser 0 days in the hands of attackers. These are very, very dangerous. In this case, all an attacker really has to do is get you to visit a website for malicious code to execute on your system without you knowing it. Although they are more rare, browser 0 days aren't something we come across every single day. They are still something that attackers are researching and finding out there, just like security experts are. Finally, there's a supply chain attack. Patrick also touched on this a little bit. It's when a company gets compromised, their software gets compromised, maybe a backdoor is put in the software, and now every user that downloads this company's software is now infected unknowingly. This is probably the most dangerous type of attack, most dangerous type of delivery attack, but also the most rare because it's so complex and so difficult for even the most skilled attackers to pull off. So what happens after the attacker gets on the system? This is a technique that's possible on both Linux and Mac and many other Unix flavors, but something where attackers have gotten a little more creative. The attackers need like a stage 2 type execution. Most backdoors and malware comes with a stage 2. So you get on the system, that's usually the exploit, and that's stage 1. And now you download the backdoor, this is kind of the stage 2. So one creative way that attackers have done this is they've taken malicious, say, bash code or bash scripting and put it inside of a picture file. Now, once they're on the system, they can run a curl command. Curl is used constantly in intrusions and also by admins. Curl is very useful. It lets you post items to the internet or lets you download items from the internet. And in this case, the attacker will use curl to pull down, we'll call it vacation.png. He'll then use the dd command, which lets you look inside the bytes of the file to go to the offset where that malicious code is held. Finally, he'll take that code and he'll pipe it directly to, say, a bash shell or a ZSH shell or whatever have you. So one of the reasons attackers like this technique is because it's very stealthy. It doesn't leave any forensic evidence. It doesn't, from a network packet type of perspective, you're looking at legitimate websites being visited, hosting what look like legitimate pictures. And also, those pictures are never hitting the disk here. They're going to memory. The code is pulled right out of the picture and run directly in memory. So for forensics, it's very tricky to find this backdoor or this stage 2 dropper unless you're scanning in real time for it. So recon, once an attacker gets on a system, maybe he's planted his backdoor, or maybe he's come in through SSH. There's a number of different commands he can run. But first, before we get into that, take a look on the left side. You'll see what kind of a traditional process tree looks like. And process trees give us context into what's currently happening on the system. So when a command runs, we can look up the process tree and generally have an idea of what's actually happening on the system. For example, here, we see launchd runs. Launchd is the first process to start up on Mac, and it's running the SSH service. A bash shell spawns from that, and ultimately a bunch of commands. So what we can kind of infer happened here is that someone came in through SSH, opened a bash shell, and is now running recon commands. So some of these recon commands, these are not most of these are specific to Mac. There's a whole slew of commands that an attacker is going to use, but these are some of the unique ones on Mac. System Profiler is a great one to give you almost any information you'd ever need about the current system you just made it onto. That's anything from the number of cores that the system's using, some of the different Apple Pay high-level information, the SDKs installed, the Bluetooth devices within that have been connected to before, just some really interesting information for attackers to get their hands on. SWVers is going to be much more quick than that. It's just going to tell you, hey, this is the version of macOS that this user is running. The DSCL list users command, DSCL is, as you might know, used for all types of administrative action on Mac. In this case, this is kind of the same as catting the etc password file, but more of a Mac unique way to do that. So you're going to get a list of the service users on the system, as well as a list of the hard users on the system that use it. Ping, this is obviously not Mac specific. Ping is on almost any flavor you can think of, but we include it here. Because ping is used nonstop for testing network connect, seeing if computers are up. The -C1 switch is used very frequently, which just sends a single packet or just a single ping to look for a response to see whether that system is up or down. One of the more unique commands, which I love to point out, is the DNS-SD command. This is actually somewhat of a bonjour service wrapper where you're able to scan for bonjour services that are being broadcasted on the network. So what attackers will do will say something like, in this process tree, if I'm an attacker and I've come in through SSH, clearly I have a set of SSH credentials that I've stolen. So I'm going to scan the network to see if anyone else is broadcasting the fact that they're using SSH. And if they are, I'm going to try my same credentials on that system to see if I can break into it. So this comes very handy in lateral movement. So persistence. Once an attacker makes it on the backdoor, he wants to get his backdoor installed. So this again shows the attacker coming in through SSH. He's using the curl command to pull down a binary. This binary is a Mach-O executable, which he then gives executable permissions to using chmod. Touch-R is an interesting command. It actually lets you take the timestamps of one file and apply those timestamps to a new file. In this case, the attacker goes and grabs a file that's been on the system for a long time, legitimately, and he applies those timestamps to his new backdoor. This is sometimes done, sometimes it's not, but it's a form of anti-forensics. Basically a way, if someone caught onto him, maybe did a timeline of the file system, this is kind of going to throw a wrench in that plan on traditional timeline forensics. The etc cache file, this is a hidden file. This is made up and specific to the backdoor being used in this case, and it's a config file, oftentimes seen packaged with the backdoor. It holds things like the IP that the backdoor should talk to, as well as the port, and maybe a password if that needs to be included or something. He chmods the config file so it's less likely to be found by anyone but an admin, and then ultimately creates a persistence item so that this malware will run when the system restarts. In this case, he calls it com.apple.software.plist, and which is going to blend in very nicely with the system. If you've ever looked at all the files that are deeper in the system, you've seen a lot of com.apple.this or that. So the backdoor that I'm kind of referring to here is TinyShell. TinyShell is used by attackers for a couple different reasons. One of the big reasons is because it's open source. It can be found for Linux very easily and modified very simply for Mac, and attackers have taken advantage of that. They've done this in both distributed malware and targeted malware, so we've seen it in both cases where a attacker malware is based on the open source tool here. One of the things they've done with it, or that we've seen them do with it, is write a my-decode function into the malware, where it basically lets them encode the different strings that are, say, in the config file or in the binary itself. So if you are able to pull this binary back and try to reverse engineer it, it becomes much more complicated and takes a higher level of skill set than just kind of glancing at it to make that determination of, okay, yeah, this is bad. So lateral movement after an attacker is ready to start spreading across the network. We touched on this a little bit already. The attacker can log in through his malware that he's now installed, and he can start making attempts to start trying this username and password combination elsewhere using SSH or tools. If he can get a reverse shell on a system somewhere, he can use netcat to accept that reverse shell and then repeat the entire process. He can now recon the system, drop the malware, and start moving on to the rest of the system until he's spread out on enough systems where he's comfortable. So I'm going to pass it back to Patrick, who's going to talk a bit about the protections Apple has put in place for this type of stuff.
Awesome. All right, so now let's switch gears and talk about some of the built-in security mechanisms. And we'll see ultimately that they are a great start, but unfortunately, they're not a panacea. So macOS now ships with a large number of baked-in or built-in security mechanisms, malware mitigations, anti-exploitation techniques, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these include XProtect, the malware removal tool, code signing certificate checks, and notarization requirements. And the goal, of course, is that Apple would love to proactively protect Mac users from malware and malicious attackers. So first off, we have XProtect. This is a simple signature-based AV product or capability that's baked in, built into all recent versions of macOS. It's limited, though, to scanning files that are downloaded by the user the first time they are executed. XProtect's detections, their signatures, are located in a system file named xprotect.yara. If you're familiar with Yara, it's an open source public technology language for writing especially malware and detection signatures. So if we take a peek at these signatures, right, they're not encrypted, they're just sitting in this Yara file, we can see what XProtect is looking for. So for example, we can see that it's going to look for KeyRanger, which is a nasty piece of ransomware that's targeting macOS. Next, we have MRT, or the malware removal tool. It's another Apple-created AV-type tool that ships, again, built into the macOS operating system. It's similar to XProtect, but has some differences. So unlike XProtect, it scans for malware that may be already on your system. And then if it finds any, it'll automatically remove it. Also, unlike XProtect, the signatures for MRT are not in an external file, but actually compiled directly into the MRT binary. And as an interesting aside, Apple also uses MRT to remove legitimate software with no user interactions if Apple believes that such software is unsafe. Now on to code signing checks. So most binaries on macOS are code signed. This often also includes malware, simply because Gatekeeper does not, by default, block signed code. A benefit, though, to Apple and the rest of us who care about the security of our Macs is that requiring code to be signed, if it's detected that it is malicious, what Apple can then do is revoke the signing certificate that was used to sign the malware. And this means then the malware will no longer run on any other Mac systems. So on the slide, for example, we can see that the code signing for certificate for Windtail, remember the malware that targeted the individuals at the Middle Eastern government, has now been revoked. This means if the attackers try to use Windtail with that same code signing certificate, their attack will be unsuccessful because macOS always checks the code signing certificates before an application is run. And obviously, if Apple has revoked that certificate, that application will be blocked. Finally, with the release of Catalina, Apple has added some extra, even more powerful security improvements, such as code notarization. So in short, Apple now requires applications to be submitted to Cupertino for notarization, which includes scanning them for malware. Unnotarized applications, as we can see on the slide, will be blocked. And also, as this screenshot shows, a kind of interesting Twitter conversation I had, that this new code notarization requirements are causing problems for hackers, in some cases rather hilariously. So in this case, the attackers created a malicious application. They said, OK, we realize it has to be notarized before it can run on Catalina. They actually then submitted that application to Apple to be notarized. What Apple did the next day was then revoke all the certificates and obviously revoked the notarization, which then, as we can see, said to the hackers, this ruined our entire operation. So again, hooray, we're stoked. Now, however, as is often the case with security mechanisms, these really don't make that much of a difference, at least to a competent hacker. And we're going to walk through exactly why I personally believe this is the case. So first, if we look at XProtect, it's a purely signature-based detection mechanism, meaning it's trivial to bypass. So here again, we have the signature for KeyRanger. Again, that's a nasty piece of ransomware that was targeting macOS that has a built-in XProtect signature. If we look at that signature, though, what we can do is we can map it to a sequence of instructions in the binary. So this is what macOS is scanning and will match for. So once we know where that signature maps to in the binary, what we can do is we can either just rearrange those instructions or subtly modify them. This will, of course, change various bytes, which will mean the signature will no longer match. Now, of course, this means the malware's functionality will not be impacted, but this 1 byte change will now thwart the xprotect signature. So here's a demo of this. We have 2 instances of KeyRanger. On the left, we have the original sample, and on the right, we have a sample that has a 1 byte modification. We're going to see that when the user launches the original sample, macOS will correctly detect that this application is infected with KeyRanger and block it. However, the second sample, which we launch, again, it has this 1 byte modification, will be allowed to execute because the xprotect signature will no longer match. And we can see now if we pop into a shell, yes, indeed, the malware is executing, and now we'll start encrypting all the files on the system. Since MRT, like xprotect, also uses signatures, it's also very easy to bypass. So as I mentioned earlier, the MRT signatures are embedded directly into the MRT binary. So what we can do, or what an attacker can do, is simply dump the strings of this MRT binary to figure out what signature it has. And as we can see on the slide, there is an embedded signature for fruit fly, which is the backdoor we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. If we examine the signature, if we extract it from the MRT binary, we can see that the signature is based both on the path of the malware and its launch agent plist. This means all an attacker has to do is either change the name of the malware or the name of its property list file, and MRT will no longer detect it. Now, I noted that Apple has clearly made improvements, especially in Catalina, and so for this, they should definitely be lauded. However, it's still rather trivial to hack even a fully patched macOS Catalina simple. So here's an example. So recently, there was a public day 0 vulnerability in Microsoft Excel for Mac. And what the vulnerability allowed was for the silent and automatic execution of macros. So if a user opened a document, the macros would automatically run. However, good news is these macros were first constrained in a highly restricted application sandbox. And then secondly, they would have to contend or be constrained by all of Catalina's new security mechanisms. So this is good news. This means no real damage, right? Well, unfortunately, we decided to take a closer look at this bug and also the new security mechanisms in Catalina. And first, we found a very trivial way to bypass the application's sandbox. This means now the macros can execute outside the context of this very restrained environment. Then we also found a way to bypass all of Catalina's new security mechanisms that we talked about, specifically code notarization. Now, we love Apple, and this is my personal opinion. That might be somewhat controversial, but I think it's very important to really take a close look at their security claims. Because, I mean, it's 2019, and for me, it's a little depressing that one user can open one document, and this will bypass everything on the system, allowing a remote attacker to fully compromise even a fully patched macOS system. So on that rather somewhat disheartening note, Jaren will now talk about some extra protections that aim to truly keep Mac users secure. And then also dive into how Jamf, we're creating detection rules and analytics that we are researching and shipping with Jamf Protect.
So cool. So yeah, we'll dive into a bit of how Jamf Protect is working at a more advanced level. So one of the things we like to say is that we kind of pick up on the security level where Apple is leaving off. So one of the things that we like to do and that we base a lot of our detections around is behavioral-based detections. If you've had a conversation with us at the booth or anything, you've probably heard us say this. So as where a lot of these Apple products are looking for static signatures, things like the file hash mixed with maybe the file size, mixed with maybe the strings that are inside the file, we're looking for what that malware does. An example of this could be something like ransomware. Ransomware, you could pick up a single family with some certain strings and detect on that family maybe when it's run on different systems. But what if you wanted to take a greater look at ransomware in general. You'd look at the operations that are happening on the file system. You'd see files being encrypted. And by looking for this behavior, you could potentially detect all families of ransomware versus just a single family of ransomware. So we do this by collecting a number of different events and feeding them into something we call Monitor Kit. Monitor Kit is at the heart of our product. It's something we built in-house, and essentially it's taking different events that are happening on the system, and it's standardizing those events to something that we can then write rules for in an if-then type of logic. It's constantly being updated, so when we think of a new event that we could write additional detections off of, we'll go ahead and get those fed into Monitor Kit as well, and now we have a whole nother slew of events that we can base detections off of. So some of the benefits to what we've been doing, well, the endpoint security framework is something Apple has released in Catalina, and we're able to, take this into account, take these changes into account that Apple has now given us to provide a more seamless experience. So we no longer have to go out and try and collect some of these events ourselves because Apple is now providing them for us in a nice standardized way. So here on the screen, you're just seeing some of the different notifications that we're able to plug into, and one of those highlights being the new endpoint security framework, and this is definitely going to help us in the future remain kexless while trying to apply, like in some of the demos you've seen, things like prevention. So one of the major items that we base a lot of detections off of, as you've kind of seen in previous slides, are processes. Every action that occurs on the operating system can be tied back to a process that caused this action or this behavior. So by looking at processes, we can actually come up with some truly unique behaviors. So we can see when a process is created, we can pull back the file path, the command line that was used at runtime, even the signature information of that binary that was executed. And this is a great way for us to build new detects. The same goes for file monitoring. So file monitoring is another item that we base a lot of detections on, and this is what we're going to talk about in a second because there's so many different use cases for just processes and file events alone. So when a file gets created, when a file gets deleted, we can see these things, say it gets modified or its extended attributes even get modified. We can see these changes, and we can even tie it back to the process that caused these file changes. We can take snapshots of files. We can tell you the difference between if you're looking for a specific file, we can tell you what it looked like versus what it looks like now, what the changes were made. And there's so many use cases that come into play with that. So just to bring this all together, so we have Monitor Kit that's grabbing all the events and feeding all these events to Jamf Protect. We have analytics that are set up as like if-then rules. And then finally, to bring this all together, we have the Apple Game Logic Engine. So game engines are used for taking multiple events happening on a system at once inside of software like games, which is just so many different events that are occurring. And Monitor Kit actually has that same type of setup. So in the interest of staying native and not reinventing the wheel, we're able to use the Game Logic Engine to analyze all these events and use our analytics through them. Now, if one of these fires, we can alert to the UI, we can log to the UI, and among a couple other things as well. So let's talk about the analytic life cycle. So analytic creation actually gets put into the hands of users as well. So those using Jamf Protect can actually create their own analytics or own detections. This is relatively uncommon in security software where we give you this power. At the same time, us over at Jamf Protect will be working on what we hope to have as really strong detections that we can push out to all our customers, and hopefully they'll work in a seamless manner, as where if you know what's best for your environment and you know certain detections are going to work at your environment, you're able to write those in yourself as well. So the typical detections research cycle looks like we come up with an idea and we release it. We observe it, we see how it's behaving, we see if the results that are coming back look good, if they don't look good, and if they don't look good, we'll tighten them up. We'll add an additional, okay, so if this happens, clearly we're returning too many false positives on that. So let's tighten that up by adding another use case. and once it's tight enough, we'll release it. So you go in that circle for a while until you're able to develop a really strong analytic. So an example of this would be, let's take the touch-r command. I touched on this earlier. Thank you. I touched on this earlier where the attacker takes the timestamps from one file and applies those timestamps to another file. Let's say we want to write an analytic for any time touch is run with the -r argument. We can do this relatively easily. Some of you with smaller environments, maybe not a ton of developers at your company, this could be a very solid detect and one that you're able to apply. For others that maybe have a lot of developers, sometimes there's things like compilers that will complain if a certain code file is significantly more outdated than the rest of your code. Touch-r exists for a reason like this, where I can say, no, I want that to compile. I can take the timestamps of one code file, apply it to my outdated code file, and now it will compile with no issues. So this is just a use case where you have to, an edge use case, where you have to take into account, okay, this is not a strong detect, it's firing some false positives, let's tighten it up. So by tightening it up, we can say something like, all right, so don't tell me every time touch-r is run, tell me every time it's run within the context of an SSH session. And we can do that by, once again, looking at the process tree and getting that context. So we check the parent, we say, hey, is this SSH? And the answer is no, so we check the grandparent process, we say, is this SSH? It says yes, so we say, all right, this is under an SSH session, let's log this to the UI, or let's alert to this in the UI. Another example of maybe tightening this up is saying, is by specifying which files you care about touch-r being run on. Perhaps maybe the launch daemons. Maybe you care if somebody tries to fake the timestamps of launch daemons versus if they try to fake the timestamps of some file that's inside of the user's home directory. Detecting untrusted children. So you may have seen this slide in some other presentations as well. Patrick's talked about some really scary stuff in terms of 0 days about Excel macros just being able to execute without you even knowing anything. So one thing we're researching to try and to see if we can develop a very strong detect for would be something like anytime something signed by Microsoft spawns something, a child that is not signed by Microsoft. You figure there should be maybe a few use cases where this happens legitimately, but the major question becomes, is there enough use cases where we can whitelist the ones that happen legitimately and just focus on the bad? So this is one example. In this case, we see Bash and Python spawning from an Excel document, and we don't really want that. The other plus side about Jamf Protect that a lot of security products won't give you is that, say that I have a group of accountants that do use Excel macros. They use it to, for whatever accountants do. And so they're triggering off this detect all day, and you don't want to see that. That's just causing all false positives, and it means you got to go through all these alerts and try and sort out if they should be happening or not. What you're able to do is build in your UI, you're able to build an agent specifically for accountants, where it says, let macros run for accountants. This is okay. It's expected. This is one of my favorite slides. One thing I love to do, it's less practiced in threat hunting, but detecting attacker mistakes. It's actually a lot of fun when you're doing analysis, you're looking through all the commands that were run, and then you come across a command, you're like, nope, that didn't work. Nope, that didn't work. Nope, by now he's smashing his head against the keyboard. So some of these commands are things like netcat. Netcat is kind of the Swiss Army TCP tool, if you're not familiar. Basically lets you make connections to IP addresses on certain ports, commonly with a specific program that you have in mind. This is specified on most Linux distros with the -e switch. And the Apple version of netcat does not have this switch, thank goodness. But basically what this says is, hey, run a remote shell connecting back to my attack control server somewhere. So when the attacker runs this, it fails. But since we can see commands that were executed, we can see that this switch was actually used inside of the command line argument somewhere. Now this is a big bonus because we know it wasn't legitimate software doing this. Legitimate software sets up testing, and legitimate software knows it won't work if it calls netcat-e. It knows that's not an option. So what we can actually do, obviously every attacker isn't going to make a mistake, but we can look for these mistakes being made and profit off them when we see them. The same goes for the make node command. Make node can be used to create a file type of PTY. PTY is commonly used when you want to create an interactive shell. So let's say you have a connection made over some tool where your shell is not interactive. So in other words, you type in the sudo command. Normally you expect that prompt to show up that says enter your password, and that doesn't show up because you don't have a PTY. So what the attacker does in this case is he tries to create a file that will act as a PTY, and he uses that over telnet to make a connection back to his server. Once again, the Apple make node command, unlike many Linux and Unix distros, does not have the PTY type as a file type. So if we ever see this, once again, we know that this is an unexpected behavior, and we can certainly flag it to look into it more. Here's a cool concept taking into consideration signing information and file information. So if we ever see a launch daemon get created, launch daemon being responsible for running software at startup, we can take a look at that file name. We can take a look to see if it says com.apple at the beginning. And we know that if it says com.apple at the beginning of this file name, it is some file that is claiming to be built by Apple. So what we can do is we can look inside the file after it's created. We can go to the program arguments, which holds the string that points to the binary to be executed. I know that's a mouthful, but it goes from basically once launchd is loaded, it's going to look at this string, and it's going to run the binary that it specifies. We can take that string, go grab the file, check the signing information, ensure that it's signed by Apple. So what this basically does is anytime a launch daemon is created, we can verify that if it starts with com.apple, that binary had better be signed by com.apple. If it's not, we're going to throw a detection to the UI. Process IDs. There are all kinds of process IDs that come with every process that's created. That can be the process group ID, that can be the process ID, the parent process ID, responsible ID. They go on and on. There's so many different ones. What we want to do is we want to use every process ID to our advantage in terms of detections. One of the lesser used when it comes to threat hunting is the process group ID. The process group ID is created with every process, and when it belongs to a group of processes, it gets a matching process group ID. So with the curl command that we talked about earlier, pulling down the vacation.png, pulling out the code and running it in bash, this is actually relatively easy to pick up. If we say anytime we see bash run, say with no arguments, kind of strange as it is, let's take a look at the process group ID. If the process group ID traces back to the curl command, which would be identified as the process group ID leader, then that means that some type of code was taken from curl and sent directly to bash. And maybe that's something we want to log, maybe it's something we want to alert on, but it's certainly something that we want to make sure users know. One cool thing that we can do is we can take malware, and rather than taking these static items, we can build a couple new behavioral-based items from each new malware or attack that is gone out. So instead of taking maybe the static strings from this plist, we can actually come up with the idea from Fruitfly, where we're going to say anytime a launch daemon is created that tries to start a hidden binary, let's fire detect. Hidden binary being .client because it starts with a period. The user, if they went into this directory and looked around, they would not see that hidden file. So that's a kind of an example of how we can take basic malware and build behavior-based detections off of it rather than static. Detecting windtail, so Patrick talked about how these one delivery scheme for one particular actor would be to run a custom URL scheme on users' systems. And this is done through the application's plist where it's defined. So what we can do is we can log anytime a custom URL scheme application is written to disk. We can also log anytime Safari auto unzips an application with a custom URL scheme, which gives you a nice log to go back to and look, okay, what apps have kind of done this in the past. Finally, we get the question a lot, can Jamf Protect be configured to send the events that it's seeing up to my SIEM, up to Splunk, up to whatever your SIEM might be? And the answer to that is yes. So you're able to take these events in a nice clean format and send them up to your SIEM to do your own threat hunting. and your own detections work there as well. Wrap up.
Awesome. All right, so that's a wrap. Today we started our presentation by looking at recent Mac malware samples and to gain an understanding into how these threats work so that we can detect them. Jaren also talked about what interactive attackers do, especially in the context of the Mac enterprise, in order to interactively infect and spread through the enterprise. We also showed that while macOS ships with a lot of security mechanisms, and while these continue to get better and better, hackers can still currently sidestep them somewhat easily. Now, as I mentioned, as a Mac user, this makes me a little sad, but we're hoping that by working together with Apple and by offering extra protections, our Macs and our Mac users will ultimately remain secure. And in the meantime, don't open any Excel documents, especially if they come from me. So again, thank you for attending our talk. I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Do questions.
Questions? We'll also be around after the talk if you want to come up and just talk nerdy about all things Mac security related. Yes, in the front. Is there a mic? You can just yell and I'll repeat the question.
Detecting is the first step. So what about mitigating the risk? Killing processes or...
That's a great question. So the question was, detection is a good first step, but what about mitigating? And this is something that we're very thankful to Apple for giving us this new endpoint security framework, because what it allows us to do from user mode is actually proactively stop processes before they execute. Before, you were unable to do that from the context of user mode. You had to use a kernel extension. So what we can now do, and we actually already have this, is we can blacklist certain processes based on their team ID, their code signing certificate, and in the future we'll very easily be able to, for example, when a new process spawns, before it actually is allowed to execute, we get a callback from the endpoint security framework basically saying, we've blocked this process, do you want to examine it? We can quickly apply our analytics, again, which uses Apple's game logic engine, so it does it very fastly and quickly. And then if we determine basically that one of the application is malicious or the analytic has flagged it, we can then actually terminate the process before it's run. And then do things like quarantine both the system or that specific. So that's something we're definitely working towards. And again, thanks to Apple's introduction of the endpoint security framework, it's a very powerful capability that now we can have. So thank you, Apple. Great question. Any others? Yes.
I'll just hop out. I noticed on a lot of your examples, the persistence thing was writing into library launch agents and library launch names. How is the attacker getting the elevated privileges to write to those directly?
Great question. So the question was, how are attackers essentially able to persist? For example, how do they write into the library launch daemon or library launch agent directories? And this is a good question because there's also user directories of those same types, at least for launch agents. So what the attackers will do as part of their attack vector is first get arbitrary code execution on the system. So for example, the macro bug we talked about allows them to start executing macros, albeit in the context of a very constrained application sandbox. So the next thing the attackers will have to do, and again, this is credit to Apple, as the security of the system increases overall, attackers now have to have privilege escalation vulnerabilities or sandbox escapes in order to do more damaging things like install a keylogger or persist a launch daemon. So we see a variety of attacker techniques based on the sophistication of the attackers. The simplest is just to pop a fake password prompt and basically say, hey, this application needs your password to install. Sure. And a lot of users will naively then put in their credentials, which will then give them the ability, or the malware, the ability to write to those protected directories. More sophisticated adversaries, nation states and APTs, will use zero-day sandbox escapes or privilege escalation vulnerabilities, kind of a second stage component of their attack, in order to then escalate their privileges and then be able to do that.
Another painful example of something like that would be if an IT administrator's account happens to get their credentials popped. Frequently, yeah, I've seen it happen where you know, the IT company or the IT worker, you would expect to be pretty confident, but even they can get hit with really convincing social engineering items, and they are absolutely a target. the head IT guy, anyone on IT who has passwords and usernames to get system to system. So if an attacker can come in through, say, SSH with legitimate credentials, the odds are he can run that sudo command and just jump right to root without even needing any type of zero-day.
But the good news is, so for example, in Jamf Protect, we look for some of these. For example, if a process spawns one of these authentication dialogues and then the user enters those credentials, we can basically follow that and see that step and say, oh, by the way, the user actually gave essentially root permissions to that Flash installer, which is then how it was able. But again, the good news is, as macOS becomes more and more secure, there's these extra steps or hoops that the attackers have to jump through. And they still can, but again, it's always getting more difficult. Yes?
My understanding is that you're able to actually write or send commands to the endpoint security system, the new system. So if that's true, then what is there to stop somebody spoofing Jamf Protect or spoofing a system whereby they shut down processes that are not negative?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, the fact that you can push out new analytics and essentially impact the execution of processes, what's stopping an attacker or piece of malware or a malicious insider from doing that? So first and foremost, we like to believe that we've designed the system with hackers in mind. A lot of us used to work at the NSA, so we're kind of rather evil-minded. So kind of think about, what would the NSA kind of do? So that having been said, we've really like to believe that we built security in from the ground up. That having been said, if someone has access to a company's admin panel where they're able to create new rules or analytics, those are going to be coming from a trusted source. So that's something that's going to have to be protected. Again, though, going back to the new endpoint security framework, that gives us a lot of insight into what's going on. It also allows us to protect our own processes better in user mode. Before, this was, again, something that you were rather unable to do in user mode. So now we can do things like look at who's sending us perhaps a SIG kill or SIG suspend signal. And if that's not something that's trusted, we can ignore that. So now we have a lot more built-in self-defense, again, thanks to Apple's new security improvements. But that is a good attack, something we want to be aware of, because we have seen as security products become popular, attackers will proactively try to attack them the first thing they do on the system. But good news, we're generally running at a higher privilege level when the attackers come in, so we should, in theory, be able to detect that. But that's something we always are going to be cautious about and hopefully continue to protect against. Yes, in the back. Can you speak up a little more? Sorry. So if I've heard the question, it would essentially be, can our product basically, if something is exploit, track from the exploit into across the fleet? So the good thing is, as we, assuming the agent installed on multiple systems, we have insight kind of into various activities. So via then this analytics dashboard, you can do some kind of, I guess at this point, I believe it's probably manual, but examination of events on separate systems. So for example, if one system first gets hit and then another system pops up, again, we have process execution both on those two systems. So as Jaren mentioned, if someone has SSH creds and is SSHing from box A to B, in theory, we should be able to see both of those. And if you go in and look then at the logs, you can be able to tell that. Now, in the future, I believe we'll like to get to a point where we can do more automated action and tie those and basically build a more comprehensive report or picture or story that can span multiple machines to say, okay, attacker came in over here and then interactively laterally moved across the system.
Yeah, and it doesn't tie in directly, but somewhat related is if an attacker gets on a system and drops a hash, and you have found that hash, and you know it's malicious, and you know you don't want that running on any systems, we're able to go into the prevention settings and say, hey, if this hash pops up anywhere in my environment, don't let it run.
Yes, in the front.
So a lot of emphasis on the new frameworks.
Yep.
So does Jamf Protect have any, value to non-Catalina systems versus Catalina systems?
So the question was, we've talked a lot about Apple's amazing new endpoint security framework that I'm a huge fan of. Unfortunately, though, it's Catalina only and above. So the question was, what does Jamf Protect do on older systems? So we actually started designing Jamf Protect before Catalina. We knew we wanted to be kexless, so only run in user mode, but we were not aware of actually Apple's endpoint security framework. So what we can do on older systems is provide essentially all the same experience. There are some limited capabilities that essentially will be missing. For example, some of the quarantining or killing processes, that is kind of specific to the endpoint security framework. But that having been said, the system is very comprehensive even on older systems, because again, that's what it was designed for. So basically, when the endpoint security framework came along, we basically said, hey, we now have all these awesome features that we were kind of begging and hoping for. We can plug that on top. So Catalina and above, it'll be a more powerful system that's able to protect itself better. But on older systems, it'll still be beneficial. I'm a big proponent, though, of running the latest version of macOS, because even though I knock on some of Apple's security mechanisms, they do raise the bar and make it more difficult to hack. The macro attack I talked about took me like 2 seconds to exploit on Mojave and above. Catalina took me about a day to figure out how to get around some of their new things. So it was definitely harder. Yep. Any other questions? Yes, in the front.
Does Jamf Protect do like a timelining thing if an infection happens or whatever? Because you were talking about the FS event.
Yeah, we don't have any timelining features built in just yet. That's something we could potentially build in the future and have debated, like adding some incident response capabilities to that to further better it. But yeah, that is something that we've explored and thought about.
Timestamp all the events. So in theory, we have the data and we can build out reporting and track. Hey.
Yeah.
A happened, then B, and then C, and so forth.
We have to wrap it up there. We are way over time. So if anyone wants to still talk about anything Jamf Protect, please feel free to come on up, and we're happy to discuss.
And we'll be at the booth as well. So.